Are empathy and compassion just nice to haves, or are they your leadership superpower? Karen's taking a break this week, and I'm joined by a friend of Safety Collaborations, David King. David is going to be our second friend of the Safety Collaborators, who is a learning and development activist and does some amazing work around empathy and compassion. David and I are in different parts of South Africa, and during load shedding, the internet can become a little bit unstable. So hopefully you don't have any parts that miss out. But if there are, the notes will be in the show notes. We are the Safety Collaborators, and our mission is to help people have better conversations and change the way they think about safety. David, introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit more.
Hi, everybody. Very excited to be sharing this podcast with you today. So I think my title, let's start with that, because I find consultant very dull. Hence, I just threw in the word activist, because I'm exceptionally passionate and excitable about all things learning and development. And my background is in traditional HR. That's where it all began a long time ago, and I've dabbled in all sorts of different things, including politics and drum making and traveling and being a lecturer in hotel management, having never studied hotel management. But fortunately, I believe in serendipity, and it's brought me to the space of learning and development, which is really something that now that I'm part of it, I don't know anything else. It's really everything to me. I just love every opportunity to learn more on anything related to this subject matter. Hence our topic today.
Exactly, on empathy and compassion. And I think that is such a huge topic, and I can't wait to dive into it. But before we do that, we met through the African Scottish Business Network. And it has been such a delight being a part of that network, because they're engaged, they're active. They definitely, are connectors and live the values and ethics of being a true network, and get to meet people like you, which is just absolutely divine.
I concur.
Exactly. So you mentioned the word serendipity. You never know, kind of like just being in the right place at the right time, and some major wonderful connection happens. So here we find ourselves. So welcome to today.
Thank you.
Empathy and compassion. Help me understand, what is empathy and compassion?
Ooh, okay. How much time do you have?
As long as we need.
What I really enjoy about this subject, it's a never-ending learning journey. So just as soon as I think I know everything about empathy and compassion, we discover more science and research behind it, which is, for me, that keeps me enticed constantly. So if you Googled the word empathy, you'll come up with millions of responses, and especially ChatGPT loves the concept of empathy. So give it a bash if you haven't, but that's another topic for another day. But empathy, for me, and my definition of it, is really trying to connect, understand, relate to somebody. And we often use the concept of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, which you've got to be careful about, because we wear different shoes and we have different size feet. So we don't necessarily know exactly what it's like, because we can't. So we've got to be careful of saying things like, I know how you feel. For me, that's number one when unpacking empathy. And I think there's two other very important components. The first is listening. I think a lot of people get that. I can relate, I can connect, but it's the listening is absolute key. And along with listening comes, because I'm sure you've heard that quote around, we listen to respond instead of listening to understand. And that really takes practice, because that is hard work. And that's my spotlight on me, because I'm not a great listener, because I always want to react and respond. And that was always my excuse to say, no, I'm interested in what you're saying. The other very important component that most people don't connect with empathy is suspending judgment. Are you talking to me? I need to suspend all this judginess. And the problem with that is that as human beings, we are judgy.
No, never.
And as soon as you say, no, I'm not, then you're completely disconnected with reality, or in denial. So we are judgy. It's normal to be judgy. But when we're aware of it, that's when we've got to do something about it. Because then if we're not actioning our judginess, then you're not showing empathy. But that's hard. It's hard work because
Mhm.
remember, we own things that are important to us. So as soon as somebody's saying something that we don't like, we feel it's our duty, it's our responsibility. Because some people might go quiet or withdrawn, others might actually
Mhm.
attack or fight back. But that's my definition of empathy. When you asked me the question, that was about an hour ago. So I think we've unpacked empathy. The difference between empathy and compassion is a lovely formula. Is empathy plus action is
Oh,
compassion.
I love that.
So to show compassion is action. You got to do something. Empathy, think about it. You don't really have to, doesn't have to be an action. I can still relate and can connect from afar. But with compassion, I have to actually get involved. And that's where you sometimes get people feeling, now, hang on, a little bit awkward here because I can show
Yeah.
empathy, but no compassion. Oof, no, that means to go and touch you, or I have to go and help you in some way, and I have to sacrifice. And if you do any
Yep.
research on compassion, you can't escape the word sacrifice. So there has to be something that you have to
That's
sacrifice
really interesting.
in order to show compassion. And I think often we think of compassion maybe as something being something large or something massive or something highly impressive. But it doesn't need to be, because you'll be surprised how often you may be showing compassion. And a very small example I use is, if I'm thirsty, to show compassion would be to offer me your water from your glass or bottle, instead of saying, there's a tap, go and sort it yourself out before you even asked for water. That's a small example of giving me water. Might seem a small example
Yes.
because you've had to sacrifice something. You didn't have to. Okay, you didn't have to actually sacrifice. You could.
But you choose to.
Thank you. And yet you can also
Yeah.
do massive, impressive compassion like Habitat for Humanity, or you go and offer services or help people around the world in some format. That will be a good example of compassion. And I think one interesting thing around compassion is we also need to make sure the head people, the thinkers, also connect, because often we talk a lot from the heart when we talk about empathy and compassion. But the science is incredibly fascinating. So it's research-based, and you can Google it. It's all free and available. But they talk about hormones. So the hormone oxytocin is the hormone that kicks in when you show compassion. So you create your own oxytocin when you show compassion. So I love to explain oxytocin as the nature's way of making us better human beings. Okay, it's sometimes called the love.
It's the feel-good, happy hormone.
Yes, you're happy, your love, your bonding hormone. But when you show compassion, you are creating your own oxytocin, and the person receiving compassion then creates their own oxytocin because they're feeling good about you helping them. But what's even more fascinating is that if you observe compassion, then you create your own oxytocin. So just by observing compassion between two other people, it makes us want to do it. How's that? I mean, that's why I love the definition of it makes us better human beings at the end of the day.
That's amazing.
So I hope that's clear for my examples, that what empathy is and the difference between the two.
You mentioned some really, really great points there, and I love that when you said putting yourself in others' shoes. Well, yes, you're right. We all have different size feet. We all have different shoes. And what we often say is it's not about doing unto others as you would have done to you. It is doing unto others as they would have done to them.
Yes, thank you.
So it's understanding the other person, their needs, their way of being, and adjusting your steering wheel so that you're matching them.
Yep.
And then building that rapport and that relationship.
Yep. Such an important point, because we often churn out these idioms and these phrases that sound wonderful. Everyone else is churning them out, and then you tackle them, and suddenly it's like, oh, it's actually old, outdated, or old-fashioned, or actually just plain right wrong. As you just mentioned there, it's funny. It's establishing what other people need. What do they want? Not what you want to give them. It's to ask the person, what do you need from me to assist you or to support you?
And it is, you're right. It's such a fundamental difference. And then, as you were chatting, I was thinking, that difference between empathy and sympathy.
Ooh.
Because I think people sometimes get confused with that. It's like, yeah, but I showed them sympathy and I shared my story, and I said, I've been through the same. Oh, shame. Is this what you're going through? Oh, I've been through worse, so it's not so bad. where it's so detracting and it so takes away from
Yes.
that person. And it's not I'm standing next to you, it's I'm standing over you and showing you it's all about me, actually.
Yeah, and that's a great statement, because so often people do, often they see sympathy as a pretend version. Well, they don't see it, but the researchers say it's a pretend version of empathy and compassion. So the intent is not always bad, that we intentionally go and show sympathy,
No.
but it's really ineffective because, like you said, because often it turns on, well, I've got a story. You think this was bad. Well, you should listen to my story. And sometimes it even entrenches it, like pity. It even entrenches what the person is going through. So you say things like, I can't believe all these terrible things are happening to you. Oh, shame. Why do you think all these things are happening to you? It's terrible. How do you manage? How do you cope? And we say things like that. And there's you entrenching what the person is actually, what somebody's actually going through. So yeah, you've got to be aware of the difference between sympathy and empathy.
And how that plays out. We were talking about, is this your leadership superpower? Because it has the potential. You know, if you can show empathy and compassion as a leader, it has the potential to really, really be a superpower. So how do you bring that into leadership? How do you take it from being a nice to have and a nice to talk about, and, you know, like it's somewhere in the background of values, or, you know, what we do, and bring it into something that is practical and real and is making a difference to your people and your organization?
Yeah, that question you asked there is questions that most organizations grapple with, because we've been pretty entrenched leadership in that, you know, leadership is about control, it's about power, it's about knowing everything. And what we've learned over probably the last 20 years, we've probably turned leadership on its head. But yet you've still got many leaders heading up organizations who are still sitting with that old way of thinking, and probably also terrified of this world we're moving into, where they're feeling quite redundant and outdated, and yet they've got to hold on to this. So they pay lip service to, so they know that you must lead with empathy, but they have no clue as to what that really means. So they can say it. The same goes for you know, values and organizations. It could be on a wall, but are you actually practicing it? So the evidence too around that is out there. We've been around long enough to now present a direct correlation between organizations that drive empathy and those that don't. You can see it in, I think, the way leaders, the type of leader you are, and we talk about servant leaders and compassionate leaders and leading with empathy, because the leadership style is that I don't know everything. I'm still in charge. I'm still running the show, but I'm open to learn. I'm open to listen. I make mistakes. You show your team and your employees that you are human, and that when we make a mistake, we apologize and we correct, and we can't possibly know everything. And that was the old thinking of a leader. You had to know everything. And we realize that that's not possible. Science has taught us that we all have skills, and we all have development areas. We used to call those weaknesses, but now we love the blank terminology now of saying a growth area or development area. Fortunately, the one thing I didn't highlight is that both empathy and compassion are a skill.
Can you learn about empathy, or how to be more empathetic and compassionate?
Yes, and that's, thank goodness, it should be a great relief to those that are thinking, oh my God, I don't feel empathetic. I've never been called empathetic. Or what is compassion? I don't know where I'm going to learn this. Sure, relief, it's a skill. And like any skill, we can learn. So yes, some of us may naturally have, fortunately, a genetic makeup that helps us to do things better. But if we're willing and able, and you spend enough time practicing something, practicing correctly, you can improve. So no one expects you to be a superhuman or to be the best at it. But the more you do it, the more you practice, you will always be better at it than you were before. So it also goes to that whole excuse when people say, no, there's another idiom, can't teach old dogs new tricks, because neuroscience has taught us that we can create new neural pathways in our brains all the time. Doesn't matter what our age is, it slows down the older we get, but we can constantly create new pathways of learning. So it doesn't matter if you've been the CEO for 25 years and you've been driving your old traditional ways of leadership. You have to unlearn, as we call it in our industry, unlearn and relearn something. And that's wonderful. and we're doing it all the time. People forget. We're unlearning and relearning stuff. I mean, technology is just teaching us that constantly. Keep up with stuff. We have to unlearn and go, oh, yes, that was nice. We used to do that, but now there's something new. Because if I don't, then I'm going to probably become irrelevant and redundant.
Well, and become obsolete.
And stuck in the mud.
Yes.
And we all know someone who's stuck in the mud.
Exactly.
And then it's actually that's when you want to show some sympathy, because you go, oh, shame, because they're not moving, they're not progressing. Words come out of their mouths around. That's not how it used to be. In our day, we used to do this, and that's never how I would talk to my parents, or that's never how I would engage with my line manager. You just do as you're told, and that's a dead giveaway when we start spewing out nonsense like that.
And it can be super dangerous, because you stop people from being able to do things which, in the industries that I work in, with the high hazard industries, you stop people from speaking up. You stop people from feeling included. We can go through the whole psychological safety, of feeling that they can learn and contribute and challenge the way that things were, because they're going to just be cut off or be blocked, and it's not really helpful. One thing that I forgot to mention when we started this is that you've recently been doing some fabulous work in the medical field and bringing in empathy and compassion into how does that impact not just the patients, but actually the entire working environment. Would you like to share a little bit around what is the evidence that shows that empathy and compassion is not just a nice to have, it actually makes a difference to the bottom line?
Yeah, return on investment, as most corporates and businesses want to know, what's the return on investment? It's been a fascinating journey. The clients I've been working with, I think they're absolute trailblazers in this space, because it's been something that they've tackled on board level. So it's not just been implemented at level.
So top down.
Top down, and as you know, they call these things key imperatives. So it's a key imperative of the organization. And the reason why it all began, a tiny backstory, is coming out of COVID, they realized how, in particular in the hospitals, the nurses were withdrawing from patients. So they no longer wanted to get close or even to touch patients because of the COVID scare. Even though you've put in many things to ensure that you don't catch COVID, psychologically people were just wary. And they could see a direct correlation between trust, between patient feedback, disconnects, staff turnover, innovation, inclusivity, was all related to people not feeling connected, and feeling a bit disconnected. Wow. So the research around is directly linked to boundaries too. So also, and you will know, particularly with a lot of your clients, is how critical policies and procedures and compliance is.
Yeah.
And often people in those spaces say, well, you can't have boundaries here. I can't say, no, I'm not going to do that, because it's an instruction. It's a rule. And yet we don't allow people to put up boundaries. It's going to lead to burnout, or it's going to lead to resentment. So hence we know we've had a massive problem globally with burnout. It's because we came out of a space during COVID where everything was compliant. So think about every industry you're in. In society, we were all being put under pressure to comply to regulations. Wherever you were based, anywhere in the world, there was some new rule and regulation. So that led to burnout and led to people actually resenting. And in hindsight now, we've seen a lot of, we talk about people quite quitting and people changing their entire philosophy on their jobs and what they're doing, and they want to leave and start businesses or go live on a desert island because people were put under such pressure. But coming out of that, that's what my client was, right. So we need to tackle this, and we have to be brave and bold, because we're in a compliance-driven industry. But the science is telling us that if you don't allow people to have boundaries, our staff are going to continue to be burnt out or to ultimately resent us and themselves. So that's where it came out of.
Wow.
And then I started pulling, so analytics gets very helpful. Stats on retention, engagement, innovation, and inclusivity. And they said, well, let's do some measurement here. And that's really what they've been doing to see if there's been a difference. And they've been doing this for 2 years now. And guess what? There has been a massive difference. So those sites that are driving empathy and compassion, and they use patient feedback score as their form of assessment or targets. And those sites that have been driving empathy and compassion have been allowing their staff to put up reasonable boundaries and to question. There's the psychological safety to question, to be able to come up with better ideas. There's been a reduction in turnover. culturally, people are more engaged. Innovation is popping out everywhere at these sites.
Oh, wow.
And something that's very dear to me is from an inclusion and diversity perspective, because there's also the direct link between making people feel that they're part of rather than different.
If you'd like to learn more about how to build empathy and compassion with your leaders and with your leadership team, drop us a line at hello@safetycollaborations.com and we'll set up a call to explore where you're at and how do you make this part of your toolbox of being a superhero leader. It seems to almost touch on every single metric, that's out there and have an influence, because if people are feeling more able to, boundaries is such an interesting topic.
Yeah.
If we know our boundaries, I was having that conversation this weekend with a friend about her children and how being a single mom is so difficult and she's trying to be everything to everyone. And how can she put in boundaries where her children feel more emotionally secure because they know what to expect? And if we can help children feel more emotionally secure just in that kind of space, imagine what it will do in our workplaces. Yeah. And, often as adults we go, what? No, we don't need that. Yet when we experience that lack of boundaries, that feeling that we have no control, that we don't know our expectations, we end up flat out, just disengaged and all of that. So it's really, really interesting. And, like the hospital environment, it is such a high risk environment. And similarly to the high hazard industries, because where something goes wrong, and if it goes really wrong, it ends up, with potential fatalities. And when you can see the difference of what you've experienced over 2 years of really, being involved in driving empathy and compassion in the high risk industry of hospitals, how do you think that could influence high hazard industries? So if we're thinking mining, oil and gas, nuclear, high energy, those areas.
The need is great and the need is often the same. It doesn't depend on the industry, because as human beings, all industries employ human beings. So I really feel that, I think the core beliefs in an organization, that I think there's still this belief that it can't be something so soft. And that's a terrible concept, soft skills, because they actually are hard skills and human skills. And yet it's actually the human skills that if we focus on from a leadership perspective, that can filtrate into everything that we do. So we can still have rules and regulations and policies and procedures, but are we taking a humane approach to it? Are we taking into account the people? And, customer service as an industry, they tackled that decades ago, because they used to create policies and procedures around customer service, around the business rather than the client. And then we create our rules and regulations and policies and procedures around that. So I feel it's in a way, it's something very similar when it comes to empathy and compassion, because if we put the person first and, going further into unpacking empathy and compassion, we talk a lot around humility, common humanity, because it teaches us these things. It teaches us to think, maybe I'm going through something, but I'm not alone. There are other people. And if it's been impacting me, imagine how it's impacting other people. So from a health and safety perspective, from people with the bringing up children to what's happening in society, our challenge around the high cost of living, all these things assist us in realizing we're not alone, and let me try and relate and understand other people. And that might give me some indication of how to run an organization, no matter what industry I'm actually in.
You mentioned the speed bumps that you kind of hit along the way.
Yes.
So there will be things that will possibly trip us up.
Yes.
And it's trying something new, and it's a learning journey. So are there any highlight speed bumps that you've experienced or that you've seen that you go and can think to say, well, here are some of the ones to look out for?
Yeah, and I like that concept, because so often we don't talk about the things that could prevent us from achieving what we're trying to achieve, or to look out for possible things that could deter us or distract us, because they exist. So if we acknowledge them and prepare for them, how's the lovely link to safety? Instead of just, hoping for the best, hoping we'll be okay, I'm sure it'll be fine, it's never happened before. And I'm sure in health and safety too, we often go, well, that's such an extreme something that could happen. So it's highly unlikely. So we don't tend to focus too much on that until the day it happens. And then everybody's shocked and horrified and no one's prepared because we didn't prepare for it. So, some of the speed bumps that I think we need to look out for, I'm going to just give you probably the top 5, is not listening and not learning and realizing that we can't stay the same, that we actually must take on feedback and not just say no, or we've done it before, or that's impossible. Because I think what COVID taught us is that globally things can change instantly and we can completely redirect our organization in a couple of days. And we thought never before could that happen. And yet I'm thinking about the working from home phenomenon because that had to happen.
Exactly. It was an immediate pivot.
Yes. And every excuse why it could never happen, and yet it did happen. I think another speed bump you need to watch out for is performance, productivity, and efficiency. So the obsession with these concepts. We know what's so interesting about this topic is the research shows that the best way of showing compassion and creating engagement in your environment or in any industry is to decrease the workload. So it sounds completely counterproductive. So we're saying, no, people must perform, and the more we must give them, the more, and the better you are, the more I'm going to give you. And yet by reducing a workload, people feel cared for, and they tend to work better and more effectively and more efficiently than if you load people, because then we become overwhelmed, under pressure, work-life balance goes out the window, we don't feel cared about. To me, that's also a very important speed bump to be aware of. Naturally, organizational culture, and we've seen many organizations in the world, and in South Africa, we've had some buttes of examples of corporates that have been around forever that have gone defunct for not living their values. Okay. Then I think another one is your leader's behavior. That's another example that the leader sets, like not using terminology, or they might use terminology and not necessarily practice it. And we're not stupid. People are very aware if I'm walking the talk, and we're not fooled.
No.
And you can see globally, politically, same story is happening. Politics is also being turned on its head because civil society is saying, we've given you decades to lead us, to guide us, and actually now we realize that you're doing an appalling job and we might have to take over. So that's another story for another day. And then the last one, I think, is a lack of shared beliefs. So that's quite an interesting one because you become desensitized when there's a lack of empathy and compassion. So think about what the first responders had to face in COVID because they weren't able to escape COVID. Think about the realities of working in any high-risk environment. And when you see shocking things, which other people don't see, you sadly sometimes can become immune to it. And as soon as you do that, something is wrong. That's when our red flags would pop up to go, hang on, this isn't something we should become used to. There's something not healthy here. We need to tackle it. So yeah, those are a couple of speed bumps, and I think it's good to just be aware of that and to take those into account.
With our leaders, it's really around saying, well, how do we equip our leaders and enable them to become more empathetic and more compassionate and not become like a pushover or warm and fuzzy and soft. This is not about singing Kumbaya and holding hands, but it's really around how do we meet people where they are at and have action around showing that we are not just having a nice conversation or talking the talk. Yeah. And I love that right at the beginning when you said empathy plus action is compassion. Yeah. It's not just going, I can see that you're really struggling or that you're battling with understanding what's expected of you because there's a language barrier or a cultural barrier or maybe you're new to the industry. But I'm actually going to help you learn. I'm going to help you along the next step. I'm going to make sure that I'm not putting you into an environment where I'm putting you at risk. Yeah. And putting these into your leadership toolbox and add them as, these are the superhero kind of like powers that I get to pull out that will elevate me above and beyond the rest of the leaders in my industry.
And it makes complete business sense. And that's what I really, harp on a lot about because it's always, it's not a nice to have. The word now being used, like you said, often people see compassion as something, something warm and fuzzy. But if you talk about fierce compassion is defending what you need to look after. And that's a direct link to boundaries. So fierce compassion is saying this is so important for the future of our organization that we're going to fiercely protect empathy and compassion. To me, that the language is exceptionally powerful. And I think it's for those who are feeling, oh, it's a bit soft and a bit gentle and a bit, there's time for compassion that's soft and gentle, but there's also time we actually need to stand your ground. If you think about it from a safety perspective, from diversity and inclusion perspective, from a societal perspective, we have to say, and listen, enough is enough, or that's not acceptable, and we're actually not going to put up with it. And we're doing it not because we hate you, we dislike you, it's because we're protecting what's essential and what's crucial to the success of our business and maybe even society or my family, whatever it is.
And I love that. And I think that's possibly a great place to kind of finish off today is to really germinate on that and say, how are we empathetic and fiercely compassionate about the things that are absolutely critical to what we do?
Spot on.
Thank you for joining us today. It is always lovely to have conversations that matter. And David, it has been a pleasure having a conversation with you. And I'm sure we'll do this again sometime.
Brilliant.
So please connect with us on our website, safetycollaborations.com, where you'll find the show notes for this episode. And you'll also find David's contact details there. Leave us a message on the live chat and follow us on LinkedIn. David King or Karen Ovari and me, Nuala Gage. And if you enjoyed this podcast, spread the word, share the learnings with other people, and let's create a more empathetic and compassionate workplace. Till next week, stay well and stay safe.